Shavua Tov, we're back, and hope it was a good Pesach for everyone. We're in Parshat Shmini, and as we've already kind of come to be familiar with Rabbi Foreman's conversational style, although this is a very long essay, the first half of it really summarizes an essay that we read in Vayikra and one that we didn't read, which he'll kind of allude to and give a little background in. So it kind of works nicely to pull together some of what we've seen already, and then address a central question in our parasha, in Parashat Shmini, the death of Aharon's two sons, Nadav and Avihu. I recall, I think it was probably already 2 or 3 years ago, we learned Rav Shai Held's interpretation or reinterpretation of Aharon's response of Vayidom Aharon, which is classically translated as silence, but he argued for it being interpreted as a kind of a groan, an expression of grief, and that really kind of changed the take. So Rabbi Foreman will have a reaction on that issue, and then really sort of delve into his approach to what the sacrifices are all about in order to assess the story. And I had a chance to try to dig in a little bit to Professor Jonathan Milgram's incredible Anchor Bible volumes on Vayikra and Leviticus, and there he also has a take on what's happening with this argument about the sacrifices in the wake of the death of Nadav and Avihu, and I'll try to remember to mention that as well at the end. Um, okay, so let's jump right in. The Chatat that masqueraded as an Olah, a study in grief. Parshat Shmini tells of a climactic triumph. I'm going to read not hopefully not too quickly, but sort of zip through the first half because again he's setting the scene and he'll be summarizing some of what we've seen already, and then we'll slow down. Parshat Shmini tells of a climactic triumph made bittersweet by the accompaniment of a devastating loss. The people of Israel en route to the land of Canaan consecrate a mishkan, a tabernacle to God. But just as the consecration ceremony achieves its zenith, it is marred by a pair of tragic deaths. Two sons of Aharon, Nadav and Avihu, bring incense before God in a way they weren't commanded to. In response, a blaze erupts from within the innermost, most sacrosanct part of the Mishkan, and Nadav and Avihu are killed in the flames. Quoting the Pasuk from Leviticus chapter 10, verse 2, Adonai lifnei Adonai. Fire came forth from the Lord and consumed them. Thus they died before God. Less well known, though, is something that transpires just after this. Right after the deaths of Nadav and Avihu are recorded, we hear about a certain chatat, a sin offering that was brought. Somehow a dispute erupts between Moses and their surviving sons of Aaron, Eleazar and Itamar, over whether the service for this chatat was executed properly. Moses becomes upset at Eleazar and Itamar, accusing them of wrongly allowing the meat of the offering to be burnt. Aaron, their father, comes to their defense and offers a rationale for their actions, an argument that, in the end, Moses accepts and the incident draws to a close. Why must we hear about this little episode? Comparatively speaking, it seems of trivial importance. Big things are happening. The Mishkan is being consecrated. The ceremony is marred by the deaths of two children of the high priest himself. Shock hangs thick in the air. And for some reason, the Torah follows all that up with what? An arcane debate, subsequently resolved, that some leaders got into over the granular details of sacrificial law. Why do I need to hear about that debate at all? And why do I need to hear about it right now? He, I want to suggest that this apparently obscure debate between Moses, Aaron, and his sons might have a larger significance. To see what that might be, I want to come back to something I talked about in Parshat Vayikra, a framework for understanding the relationship between three of the Torah's most basic types of animal offerings, an olah, a shlamim, and a chatat. We're going to bracket the shlamim here, but those were the three central categories that were discussed there. So he references all three, but it's really going to be about the olah and the chatat here. One of those offerings, of course, the chatat or sin offering, is right at the crosshairs of that arcane dispute between Moshe and the surviving children of Aharon. So about a dozen verses later, Moshe inquired about the goat of the Chatat, the Sirat Chatat, and it had been burned, Vihine Soraf. Moshe got angry at Elazar and Itamar, Aharon's remaining sons, and said, "Why did you not eat the Chatat in the sanctuary? For it is most holy, Kodesh Kadashim he, and God has given it to you to bear the guilt of the community and to achieve atonement for them before God." So you're supposed to eat it in order to do that, and instead it was burned. Like what went wrong here? The meat of the Chatat was supposed to have been eaten by the priests, these sons of Aaron, but instead they burned it and did not partake of it. To understand why, at that moment in time, what happened to that meat mattered so very much, I want to take you back to that paradigm we spoke of back in Parshat Vayikra. There we contrasted the Olah and the Chatat. An Olah, you will recall, is an offering that by Torah law is meant to go up entirely to God. Hence its name Olah, which means go up. A Chatat, by contrast, is not meant to be burnt entirely on the altar. Part of its meat is consumed by the Kohanim. But the contrast between the two kinds of offerings doesn't end there. When it comes to the basic significance of each, there is a certain kind of tension between an olah and a chatat. And that tension can be traced all the way back to the earliest antecedent of each offering. The chatat, taking a trip back into the garden. And this was developed further in an essay that we didn't read, but he's going to tell us what we need to know to understand the point he wants to make about our parasha. In my essay on Parshat Vayikra, I argued that the great primary antecedent for a chatat, a sin offering, is the first extended episode involving sin in the history of humanity. Adam and Eve's decision to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, followed almost immediately by Cain's killing of his brother Abel. I argued that the first chapter in that episode, consuming the forbidden fruit, prepared the way for the second chapter, Cain's killing of Abel. The latter was in some way a natural culmination of the former, and the composite of the two becomes the spiritual ground out of which the idea of the chatat eventually emerges. And again, you've got to read his whole essay there for the finer details. To attempt to understand the dispute here in Parshat Shmini regarding the particular chatat offering that attended the consecration of the Mishkan, let's revisit that forbidden fruit episode where I suggested the story of the chatat really begins. God had given a world of paradise to Adam and Eve. There were all these wonderful trees described by the text as nechmad lemareh v'tov lemachal, delightful to behold and delicious to eat. But we humans more or less disregarded them. Instead of eating from those trees, the ones that had been gifted to us, we directed our interest toward the one tree we couldn't have, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Eating from that one tree was a violation of boundaries, and inasmuch as that's so, the forbidden fruit is a kind of touchstone for all the other things the Torah eventually places off limits. When we honor these restrictions and don't violate them on some level, we show that we have some respect to the gift giver in the sky that we call God. Yeah. We understand that we are guests in the great expansive garden God has bestowed upon us, the wonderful domain that we call our world. And now let's examine the converse. What happens when you transgress one of these commands? When you've done this, even if you haven't actually acted with malice, even if you were just a little too careless and you've transgressed inadvertently, you brought a certain kind of imbalance into your relationship with God. There were these two domains in this great world of ours, that which God has gifted to us, and that which God has reserved for God's self, as it were. And you improperly crossed over into God's domain and consumed something you weren't supposed to have from there. With a chatat, you are engaging in a curious symbolic act of reciprocity. You consumed something that was out of bounds, something that was in effect in God's world. And now, you are allowing the inverse to happen. You are taking something that's rightfully in your domain and offering it to God so that God may consume it, quote unquote. Now, obviously, God has no body or mouth to eat or consume anything, but the Kohanim act as agents in this regard. God gives the Kohanim this meat from the Chatat offering and says, in effect, Consume this on my behalf to help restore the balance between me and the one who took improperly from my world. Okay, so we've reviewed the basic notion of the chatat. Again, we've covered this in Vayikra. Now we're going to talk about the olah and be able to then bring it to our parsha. So if that's what a chatat is, what is an olah? As I suggested back in Parshat Vayikra, when one offers an olah, one is adopting a very different stance. A quick look at one of the stories that are touchstones for the olah, the episode we know as the Akedah, will demonstrate why. In the Akedah, Abraham was ready to give back his child, Yitzchak. God didn't take him in the end, but Abraham's willingness to give that child to God expressed the feeling, or even the conviction, that in the presence of God, I must abandon all pretense of having any domain that is mine in this world at all. Right before we were talking about the idea that there were two domains in the world, ours and God's, and the chatat is offered when we cross over and take something from God's domain and bring it into ours, and we respond therefore by taking something from our domain and gifting it to God via the Kohanim who eat it. Um, Now we're saying that the Olah is the stance of there's really nothing in my domain. Avraham seems to recognize that even children, in whom we play an active role as co-creators, are a gift bestowed upon us by our Creator. And when the giver of that gift asks for it to be returned, there can be no holding back. At the end of the day, there is no domain at all in this world that is mine. Again, that's the posture of the Olah. Thus, if the cardinal virtue that animates the Chatat is respecting another's domain, the virtue that animates the Olah is awe. This, after all, is what the angel tells Abraham at the conclusion of the Akedah. Atayadati ki yirei Elohim ata. Now I know that you are in awe of God. According to the text, awe of the divine was the quality Abraham expressed atop that mountain. The sense of awe implies surrender and loss of self. Nothing is mine. Even the thing that appears to be most mine isn't really mine. I surrender to you, the master of all, any notion of having a domain of my own. Okay, that's the Chatat and the Olah. And now let's come back to our story. In our little trip down memory lane to Parshat Vayikra, very Rabbi Foreman colloquial speech here, in our little trip down memory lane to Parshat Vayikra, as we revisited this tension between the Chatat and the Olah, do any of these ideas resonate in Parshat Shmini, in this strange episode we've been examining involving Moses and his dispute with Aaron and his remaining sons? I think they do. Remember the story right before this odd dispute. Aaron's two elder sons had suddenly, shockingly died. And what had Aaron's response been to this sudden tragedy? When the nation's greatest celebration, the consecration of the tabernacle itself, turned into a personal horror for him. What had been his reaction? The text in Vayikra tells us that Moshe tried to console him. Hu asher diber Hashem lemor bikrovai ekadesh. This is what Hashem spoke of, saying, I will show myself holy to those who come near me. But Aaron's response to that consolation at the end of the same verse, very same verse, is terse and enigmatic. Vayidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. Here's the big question for the first part of his analysis now. How should we interpret that silence? And again, keeping in the backdrop that we saw Rav Shai deal with this a couple of years ago, and his answer was it wasn't actually silence. There was actually a cry. But taking the classical interpretation that it was silent, what is this silence? It's hard to know. It is hard to know whether Aaron's silence was meant as a response to Moshe's words of consolation, or whether it was instead a response to God. The most basic primal reality of the moment was that God had just taken his children from him. What if Aaron's silence was a response to that? If so, his silence might indicate numbness. That was another opinion we saw in Rav Shai's essay. But it might also signify something else. There is a saying that the sages of the Talmud have, shtika kahoda'a dami. Silence is tantamount to admission, meaning accepting or assent. In that silence, Aaron expressed, perhaps, a stoic admission of a hard truth, the hardest of truths anyone could ever imagine admitting to. He could have chosen to see the death of his children at this climactic moment of national celebration as a cruel outrage to be protested against. There can be no accepting this travesty. Or to move just a bit further down Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, he could have bargained in disbelief with God over it. How could you do this, God? How could you have taken them? They were just trying to come close to you. But Aaron was instead silent, and silence is a kind of admission. Aaron's silence, I would argue, is a kind of trembling acceptance. In it, perhaps Aaron touched the energy of the Akedah, the energy of awe. It would have been an acceptance of the notion that, when you strip everything else away, there really are no domains. There is no my domain and God's domain. My children weren't really mine. They were God's. All there really is one domain, and it is that of the divine. So that's Aaron's stance he's suggesting, and of course he's going to remind us that that's the stance of the Olah. We are now, I think, in a position to better understand this obscure little dispute between Moshe and Elazar and Itamar, the remaining sons of Aaron. Just after the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, a chatat is offered in the newly consecrated Mishkan. It is offered on behalf of the entire community, but it isn't offered properly. Again, we're going to reread these psukim. Moshe inquired about the goat of the chatat, and it had already been burned. He was angry with Elazar and Itamar, Aaron's remaining sons, and said, "Why did you not eat the chatat in the sacred area? For it is most holy, and God has given it to you to bear the guilt of the community and to achieve atonement for them before God." In Moshe's critique, as given to us by the text, we find some peculiar words. It's interesting the way he says it, as given to us by the text, meaning that's his way of subtly saying, it doesn't matter what Moshe actually said. It matters the way the Torah chooses to tell the story of his words, because in the specific words we're going to understand something. So whatever Moshe literally said in that moment, it's the way the text quotes or paraphrases him that gives us the hint to what's going on. Moshe doesn't just ask Elazar and Itamar why they improperly burnt the chatat instead of eating it. He adds, "For it is most holy, and to you it was given to achieve atonement." What was he saying here? He seems to not simply be referring to sacrificial law as a fait accompli. Instead, he seems to be providing a kind of rationale for the law, a reason why the chatat had to be eaten. What was he saying? Moshe's words seem to be making a point to Elazar and Itamar about the underlying way a chatat works. A chatat, when it is first consecrated, becomes Kodesh Kodashim, literally Holy of Holies. This signifies that the chatat, which originally belonged to humans, has been taken in by the divine estate, so to speak. When the Kohanim eat the chatat, and by the way, this question in general in the laws of sacrifices, when does a sacrifice become sacred, occupies many, many Mishnayot and a lot of halakha. Is it from the moment you dedicate it? Is it from the moment it's slaughtered? Is it from the moment the blood is sprinkled? Because there's some transition in status that happens from this animal that used to just graze in your pen on your property, and then this sacrificial holy object. So that's what he's describing here. The chatat, which originally belonged to humans, has been taken in by the divine estate, so to speak. It's become sanctified. When the Kohanim eat the chatat in turn, the divine estate consumes what it had taken in. So there's your stuff, then transferring it to God's estate, and then having the Kohanim eat it as representatives of God. In a sense, all this is a mirror image of the first sin. When the humans took the forbidden fruit, they reached for it and brought it into their domain, and then they ate it, consuming something that belonged to the divine. When the Kohanim eat the chatat, they take something that belonged to humans and consume it on behalf of the divine, closing the circle and restoring the boundary that had been violated. In this story, though, the sons of Aaron had not eaten the chatat, and the question is why? If it's supposed to be eaten, why was it burnt instead? Why indeed? We talked earlier about the tension between the Olah and the chatat. Bearing that in mind, let's realize that these particular Kohanim, Elazar and Itamar, had just personally lived through something that expressed the complete opposite energy of a chatat. They had just been made viscerally aware of the fact that there is, at the deepest level, only one domain, that of the divine. Indeed, in the context of this episode, the text calls Elazar and Itamar the Banav Hanotarim, the children of Aharon who were left behind. The stark allusion to the deaths of their siblings reminds the reader that Elazar and Itamar, along with their father, had just surrendered everything, that which was most theirs. They had just watched God take their brothers from them. Indeed, they had witnessed their father's silence and acceptance of this. And perhaps they shared in that visceral silence too. That's his editorial thought there, that, Aharon's silence may also have been mirrored by his own sons. And if the silence is acceptance, is recognition that even the things that feel most like ours in certain moments we have to confront don't really belong to us. And maybe Aaron's other sons also express this recognition. And so Elazar and Itamar, the remaining sons of Aaron, ended up treating this offering, this chatat, not as a chatat, but as an olah. They allowed it to be entirely consumed, just as if it were an olah. Meaning they didn't choose to eat it, which is what you would do with a chatat, but they let it or put it on the altar to be burned entirely like an olah. Their view of domains, heavenly and earthly, at that moment of supreme grief, did not allow for the subtle parsing of the chatat, the notion that there was a human domain and a godly one. No, at that moment, that notion seemed like a laughable fiction. There was just one domain now. The chatat was, in effect, an olah, meaning Elazar and Itamar changed the way they processed that sacrifice to reflect the reality they felt they had no choice but to acknowledge in that moment, that everything belongs to God. Therefore, the sacrifice of that day had to mirror that and be offered entirely to God, because they no longer could acknowledge any sense of anything belonging to them. The Kohen as priest, the Kohen as human being. Yes, Elazar and Itamar were Kohanim, but they were also human beings. As humans, as private individual citizens, what had they just lived through? Utter loss, utter surrender, the sense of no boundaries whatsoever. Their father's silence, if it could speak, might scream. Boundaries? The very word sounds like an outrage. There are no boundaries. I can take nothing for myself. Everything has been taken from me. All I can do is stand still and surrender. That's the energy of an olah. It represents authentically what they had just gone through. And this perhaps explains Aharon's response to Moshe about the burned chatat. Remember, burned instead of being eaten. For although Aharon was silent earlier after Moshe tried to console him, now, in response to the burned chatat, he speaks up to Moshe, defending the actions of his children, Elazar and Itamar. See, this day they brought their sin offering and their burnt offering before the Lord, and such things have befallen me. Had I eaten the sin offering today, would the Lord really have approved? Such things have befallen me. Would God really have approved had I eaten the sin offering? In those words, it is almost as if Aharon is saying, I feel I have no boundary of my own. How could I assert boundaries, even on behalf of God, when, on the deepest of levels, I have been made to understand that there are no boundaries? That in my anguish, I can truly lay claim to nothing. And Moshe's response, Vayishma Moshe vayitav be'inav. When Moses heard this, he approved. Ultimately, Moshe accepts Aharon's argument. And in this acceptance, we learn something about the two hats every Kohen wears. Yes, a Kohen represents the divine estate on the one hand, but he is also a human being. Sometimes those spiritual energies collide. I believe, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I believe the Talmud talks about the Kohanim as both agents of God and agents of the people. Like, I can't remember the exact terminology, but Shluchei HaMakom, and I don't know if it's Shluchei Ha'am, something like Shluchei Yisrael. So there's this notion of the identity of the Kohanim is definitely present in rabbinic literature and descriptively makes sense. A Kohen represents the divine estate on one hand, but he's also a human being. Again, in that parallel, it's who are they representing, God or the people? But in a sense, we also feel that distinction between their humanity and their divine responsibilities or divine service responsibilities. Sometimes those spiritual energies collide. This is one instance in which they did. When you're a high priest, that almost always eclipses your role as a private individual. And we see that actually in other dimensions of the story where Aaron and his sons are told that they're not allowed to mourn in this moment because they have duties to the inauguration of the tabernacle. When you're a high priest, that almost always eclipses your role as a private individual, but not always. For one brief moment, Aaron the human, in his own struggle with God, eclipsed Aaron the high priest. And in Moses' acceptance of that, we learn that it was okay. That's it. Okay, great. He has a number of long footnotes, which we'll leave for now. But the argument again here is that in choosing to burn the offering instead of eating it as it was traditionally done, it's this recognition of it as an olah and not a chatat, because in at least one instant there was a feeling of not being able to, recognize any realm that belonged to Aharon and his sons as people, but a recognition that everything must be God's if they are undergoing a loss like the one they experienced. They don't feel that they have any standing or individuality left in the world, and therefore they feel almost that they have no choice but to offer it as an olah. Before I open up for reactions, just to share, Professor Jonathan Milgram has a different, slightly more technical take, but also overlaps um, with the sort of argument here. He, if you ever read his writings and his excurses and his notes on Vayikra, it's just simply extraordinary, remarkable beyond words. The depth of the analysis of the Torah text, integrating rabbinic and medieval and modern commentaries, and the ancient Near Eastern cultic parallels and the like. And he bases himself on a um, academic biblical analysis. So he's also incorporating the vantage points of the different, documents that he understands to be the composite parts of the Torah that we have in front of us as a whole. And he argues that in the ancient world, chatat offerings, which were sin offerings, he calls them purgation offerings, things that were attempting to cleanse something that had been dirtied by an impurity, which again, those were very seen as very potent powers in the ancient world. So in broader ancient Near Eastern cult and culture, chatat type offerings, sin or cleansing type offerings, were always burnt because they were understood to have somehow absorbed that in cleansing from sin, you have to absorb the sin. And if an offering, its blood or its body somehow absorbs the sin, you can't eat it. It's so contaminated with sin that it's actually dangerous. It's dangerous to eat. And that part of the development of the um, sacrificial system of the Israelites was that they rejected to a degree, to a much greater degree than their neighbors and predecessors, they rejected the sort of some of those pagan folk notions and demonstrated that the power lay in the godly service of the people. Um, and if God could instruct you to carry out sacrificial offerings in being a servant of God and carrying out God's will, you had even more power than any power that could be embodied in the sort of forces that were at play that the sacrifices were related to. So, in the Israelite sacrificial system, by contrast to other ancient Near Eastern systems, chatat offerings were not burnt, they were eaten because the priests in eating them displayed we're not afraid of the forces of darkness and the forces of impurity that are out there in the world. When we offer chatat offerings, we're saying we can cleanse and we can even consume that cleansing offering because the cleansing practice itself protects us. And we are therefore kind of protected as Kohanim, as people who are carrying out God's will, who instructs us to do this offering, we're sort of safe and secure, and therefore we can eat it. And that was like a big, a big bold stance that Israelites took in the sacrificial kind of community of the ancient world. But there were a couple of exceptions. Um, there were certain emergency offerings when a high priest or a prince would make a mistake that would cause the whole nation to sin, and also the Yom Kippur Chatat, which was the kind of deepest cleansing of the sins of the whole year and the sins of the sanctuary, which was particularly vulnerable to impurity. Those were the remaining vestiges where those things were burnt instead of eaten, because there was still a little feeling, okay, that's got a lot of sin in it. Better not to eat it. We should burn it. But by and large, that had become sort of overcome by the sacrificial system of the Israelites. And what Professor Milgram argues was that Aaron and his sons were saying that the sin offering that was offered uh, at the time that Nadav and Avihu died, and now is supposed to cleanse the sanctuary, that one had sort of too much power in it, and therefore they had to burn it because it sort of contained whatever these notions mean in some way, subtly sort of contained the sin or the impurity or the death of these two people, their own family members, and it was too potent. They couldn't eat it, and therefore they burned it. Moshe was initially angry and upset, sort of like, we as Kohanim, as in following the dictates of the system, we're able to overcome that kind of thing, and therefore this should have been eaten and not burnt to show that our status as Kohanim, following God's will, overpowers any of the forces, the dark forces that are kind of being cleansed by these chatat offerings. But that in this one really unusual case, um, you know, there's sort of a debate, and Moshe is able to kind of hear them and say, okay, in this maybe in this case, we understand why the burning needs to happen, and that's kind of accepted in the story. But that the tension there is kind of about whether we have dimensions, how much we allow in any dimensions of that old system, and a tiny kind of letting it in some small way in this story. But in a sense, it also highlights the way that that's unusual in the sacrificial system. So an interesting take of Professor Milgram, which again sort of overlaps a little bit the version that we're seeing here from Rabbi Foreman, which is much more focused on kind of the spiritual themes of kind of, is there any realm of the self or not? And Professor Milgram's, which is a little bit sort of more on how extreme the power of these deaths might have impacted a sacrifice. So thank you for indulging not just the long reading, but also that additional perspective. And I see Bracha's hand and Lance's hand, and then I'll take a peek at the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Bracha.
I think Lance had his hand up first.
Okay, fair enough.
I just wanted to point out, I put in the chat one of the most incredible coincidences that I have found in a long time, because Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, talking about Shmini, has an essay he calls Limits. He talks about limits and crashing through limits. And I thought that was an incredible coincidence. I would call it a God wink, and I don't even know why I was blessed to find it. Anyway, click on the link, click on the blue link, and you get the essay.
Great.
You can read it for yourself and compare and have fun.
Great. Thank you. Look forward to reading. Bracha, back to you.
Yeah, so I'm thinking not just about the trauma of losing two brothers, but I'm also thinking about your mention of the Akedah earlier, and what the additional trauma and concern might be, sort of like one false move and we're toast. So it's a combination of the family trauma as well as the personal trauma that I think relates to this.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And I try to remember. I don't think we see that quite as explicitly expressed here. In the wake of Korach, I think we really see it very, very strongly. The people have this explicit reaction of sort of, how can we even serve, like if we're always on the verge of getting burnt up or swallowed alive. I think we very much have that there. It's reasonable to imagine that exactly these tightly policed boundaries and the high stakes of violating them are very much present in this moment for, Aaron and his remaining sons, as they're called. Yeah. James?
Yeah, if they change the chatat to the olah, I understand what he was saying about the symbolism of each of them, but the chatat has a specific purpose that changing it to an olah doesn't seem to encompass the same purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. He's a little bit vague about that, whether he's suggesting that they, in their minds, whatever it means, they kind of shifted its identity to an Ola. It doesn't really feel in the text like that's borne out, but just that somehow and he's also uses this sort of passive voice, almost like allowing it to be burned. They sort of introduce this symbolic dimension of the Ola. Um, he's a little bit vague there. In one of his footnotes, he tries to spell it out a little bit more, and I think he still leaves it um, in its sort of formal status as a chatat, but one that kind of gets a dimension of it gets carried out like an olah. It's a little bit vague. It's a little bit unclear. So you're absolutely right to raise it. Um, and
I guess my question to you is, what do you see as the purpose of the chatat there in this ceremony?
Right, right. So he goes into this at length in the footnotes because the the Gemara seems to understand that the specific chatat that they're talking about was the Rosh Chodesh chatat of that day, as
Hmm.
opposed to one of the inauguration chataot of chatat chataot of the day.
Chatat.
Um, but that's a rabbinic interpretation. I think Professor Milgram seems to understand it as one of the special inauguration chatat offerings, not the Rosh Chodesh chatat offering. Um, so it really is not clear. I mean, it's such an opaque episode, and I don't think there's kind of one clear explanation that explains it all. But it's worth reading through the footnotes here. But I don't have a good, simple, clear answer.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Joan and Moshe, and then mom and dad.
Okay. You said that silence is a form of omission, right?
Of admission, like of acceptance.
Of acceptance. I always thought that, that the reason why Aaron was silent, because like you could say the kids, his two sons that came, that drank wine also. You could say that they were like, addicts, that less the parents are the less know if the kids are, drunkards or addicts, and he just, finally accepted that it was like maybe it's his fault. I didn't realize that. And maybe the reason why the kids went into that, maybe they didn't want to become Kahanim. It's like I know a lot of times, I know when I went to yeshiva, I'm not gonna mention his name. I know it was like he came like from a big line of rabbinic families, and everybody expected him to become a rabbi. But I know he became like a very successful business in Brooklyn. I don't want to say, I don't want to give his name because if I tell you what he did, you may know of him, but you know, that's, how I feel about, the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're referencing the midrashic um, interpretation that the sin, so to speak, of Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu was that they drank wine and they entered the sanctuary drunk. I think
Right.
it's based on the fact that after the episode, God specifically, the next command from God is not to drink wine before coming into the sanctuary, and so
Mhm.
that from that juxtaposition that the sages offer that interpretation, it's one of 5 or 10 suggestions about why it was that Nadav and Abihu were killed. And the plainest sense, although that in itself is very hard to stomach, but it relates to Bracha's point, was just that they brought a sacrifice that they weren't instructed to bring, and the precision of service and the following guidelines in God's holiest of places has to be complete. And at the moment of inauguration, to have brought an unprescribed offering was just, in a sense, the ultimate transgression. But it's so difficult to stomach that for so many that the sages give all kinds of other interpretations. One of them is this wine one, and I think you have a really fascinating interpretation of it, that they were really kind of struggling with their place as Aaron's sons who maybe didn't want to follow in his footsteps, and that sort of led to all kinds of downstream effects and disasters. And Aharon was coming to grips with that in this moment in a way that he hadn't previously, which is a very, very powerful reading of the story. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
And also, what I want to say, it seems like Rabbi Foreman, he always like, no matter where he's in, the Turks. I remember I was watching him on JBS. He was talking about, Esther. He always goes back to Bereshit. He always makes some type of connections to Bereshit. Is that is always, I guess, modus operandi?
Yeah, I think that's very often his
The
goal
book of
because
Esther, you're saying that Haman has to do with like when God says from I think the word min, type of fruit supposed to be like you could say it's like it's the name of Haman,
yes, the Talmud says that. It says, where do we find a reference to Haman in the Torah? And it's God, when God says Hamin ha'etz hazeh, did you
Right.
eat from this tree which I told you not to eat from? No, so that I don't think the Talmud has as much a preoccupation with bringing things back to Breshit, but Rabbi Foreman does, because he sees those foundational stories as kind of the starting points of so many of the themes and institutions which we'll later see in the Torah. So to understand them when they appear in their institutional form, you have to go back to whatever their initial narrative precursor will be.
So he does that quite frequent, you're
Yeah,
saying. All
yeah,
right.
yeah. I think we'll see it some more.
All
Mom and Dad, yep.
So I'm looking at this one of the Psalms that we read every day over Pesach. It has the verse Hashemayim Shemayim Ladonai or it's no sign of Adam. The heaven is God's domain, and He gave the earth to us. So it seems to me that the psalmist, in a way, is pushing back against this idea that there's only one domain.
Yes.
And you have the same thing in that story in the Talmud about the oven of Achnai. Eventually, the rabbis say to God, "The law is in our hands. We make
Yes.
the decisions now." So
Yes.
I'm just wondering how Rabbi Foreman would reconcile that.
Yes. Yes. I mean, in that first essay in Vayikra, I felt what he was expressing is we have there are moments and there are times when, even if fundamentally the world is divided into those two domains, you're forced to acknowledge that that's also in some way illusory or not entirely true, and that even the things that seem like they're ours are not really ours, right? So because of course, uh, uh, I can't remember now where it is in the Torah, and I think in Devarim, when God talks about not selling the land in perpetuity, God says something like "Ki li kol haaretz," the whole earth is mine.
Mm.
So on the one hand, the psalmist says God gave the earth to humans, but in another way, the whole thing is mine. So I think that's even the language he was using about the gift giver, right? So yes, God gave it to us. We have a right to use it, and we lay some sense or experience of ownership over it. But when we stop and remember that verse itself says God gave it to us, so then the owner could revoke the gift at any time.
Mhm.
So I think you touched on that duality or that tension very, very well, that most of the time as we move throughout the world, we operate on the assumption that the things in this world generally are ours. But then there are moments when they're taken away from us. And in those moments, or moments of great awe, when we sort of somehow say, well, that's our default assumption, that's our way of operating in the world, but at a deeper or higher or whatever level, actually nothing is ours. And the two things interact sort of and coexist, I guess is what I think.
So I'm just thinking about the idea of free will. God has given us free will, but like in the story of in Shemos, God takes it away from Pharaoh. So he
Yes.
he always wins.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. No, I think
sometimes when he gives in, God, for that moment, he is given in, but he
right.
never completely.
Right, right. I think that's nice. There's like again a standard operating procedure, and then these exceptional moments. And you could say the exceptional moments, neither one is the true reality. There's the way things generally work, and then something that's operating behind the curtain that's also true, and we don't necessarily touch or access most of the time. Yeah, great. Great. Before I come back to Lance, just checking the chat. Dara asks, was it specifically the role of the sons to eat it versus Aharon? I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I certainly think that chatat offerings in general were eaten by any Kohanim. I don't know if there was a particular. I don't think there was any specific assignment to the Kohen Gadol, but I also think the Kohen Gadol could partake. Because you're right that in the story there's sort of a movement back and forth between the two. Moshe gets angry at Elazar and Itam. Aaron says, "Why didn't you eat it?" But then, Aaron answers, "Look, they brought this, and this happened to me. If I had eaten it, would God have approved?" So Aaron responds about his own eating when Moshe gets angry at Elazar and Itamar about their eating or not eating. So there does seem to be both of them. And just looking at Ruth's comment about how much the focus is on the individual, not the communal or family loss. Yeah, maybe we can learn something about how sometimes it's hard to sit down and eat with family or brothers or even with God. Yes, I think that's true. It's definitely true. So thank you for those thoughts and that tension, more on that tension between, what we're given to use and whether it really belongs to us. Very, very real. Yeah, back to Lance.
If the rabbis in the oven of Aknai reject the black coal and the rabbi who is on the side of God, why is it that at the very end of the story, God kills the head of the Sanhedrin?
What do you think?
Well, I think it's totally wrong. I think rabbinic Judaism is a joke. Of course, I'm a Cohen president.
Yes. Yeah, interesting.
Could you give us the context? He's talking about killing
What is that?
yeah, when is that?
You want to give a quick summary of the story, Lance? I don't want
at the end of the story, Ima Shalom, who is married to the
What's
rabbi who is excommunicated, a rabbi who sees the oven as pure, as opposed to all the rabbis who see it as impure. And God comes along and says, here's a miracle here, miracle there. Here's the bakol. This rabbi is right. All rabbis are wrong. But guess what? A rabbi pipes up and says, God is, it's just a joke for God, and he's really on our side, and the rabbis have all the power, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the story, and by the way, Rabbi Joshua Heschel has never read to the end of the story, as far as I can tell. And most people have, including most rabbis, have not read to the end of the story. And if you don't like that, if you don't believe in that, then read the parable of Rabbi Love, Rabbi Rahumi. in which a rabbi is sitting in a yeshiva, and he is fascinated by a halachic principle. Because of that, he misses his ride to see his family, which he sees once a year, his family once a year, because he is in a yeshiva. He is studying with a great rabbi. He is the halachic expert. Family comes before halacha. Family comes before Torah. According to that, that's in the Talmud. It's Talmud. And so, if you read to the end of the story, you will see Ima Shalom is protecting her brother by having her husband avoid doing something. And one day the husband makes a mistake or whatever, and boom, her brother is killed, dead. Now, God did it. God kills the rabbi who's studying halacha. God is in charge, right? Or not? That's the question.
I mean, where's this in the Talmud or?
This is in the Talmud. Yeah, I put a link to a summary of the story and some interpretations from Wikipedia into the chat if you want to look at it. It's a story Lance references from time to time, so it's good.
But
to know for classes that Lance is in.
What's the connection?
What's the connection here?
And number two, you also mentioned another point I want to bring up that brothers don't like sometimes don't like sitting with other brothers to eat. You could say that you could bring up with Joseph and his brothers. I'm sure they went through eating before Pharaoh that they didn't even recognize that it was his own brother. That's that's number one. And number two is there like another parable where the two witnesses came to say that they saw the sliver of the moon, and then one rabbi says no, they're wrong, and another rabbi says, I order you to come, with your purse and your staff, is the base of Medrash, and he goes like this: if I'm wrong, let the tree be uprooted. If I'm wrong, let the screen that runs on the base of Medrash run backwards. If I'm wrong, let the walls of the thing. And I suppose there was like a heavenly voice that says, that rabbi is right, but the Torah lo min hashamayim, it's on the earth.
That's
Right. I think you may be conflating two stories, but more to unpack here. I think these are great conversations, but a little further afield, and actually probably we're
Exactly
at a good pausing point. But happy to continue the conversation offline on these rabbinic stories and how they might connect or what we can learn from them. So circling back to James' point, also, there is a subtlety here about exactly whether we're talking about a real kind of halachic change that happens or just a change in framing. But it's hopefully what we got from Rabbi Foreman was, and I feel this way, I've often said this with Rav Meidan, whether the answer was sufficient or not, we're now sort of attuned to this narrative postscript to the death of Nadav and Avihu, this story which seems to really harp on the detail about the offering that was burnt instead of being eaten. What are we meant to make of that? Why is that so central in the story? So we have at least a couple of starting points of ways to think about it. There are others. The outsized story of the death of Nadav and Avihu looms so large, trying to figure out the place that this little story has in the bigger narrative is something to reflect on this Shabbat, and look forward to continuing next week. Yeah, Lance, a quick last word, quick.
If you look at this, as Elijah goes up to heaven, Elisha wants to say something, and Elijah says to Elisha, silent. And what that means is when you keep silent, then the people you are looking at go up to heaven. Anybody think that Native and you went to heaven? I don't think anybody said that before, have they?
Right. Just very right. I think a wide range of interpretations could be made about silence. I wouldn't jump to link one to the other. Although the Midrash is fond of those kinds of things, so an open for interpretation. Bracha, last.
Just checking to see if we have time for my Pesach comment or whether I should save that for another time.
Please remind me for next week. We'll do it for next week. Bli neder. Yep. All right, lots of more good stuff in the chat from Ruth. Good to have you back with us, and hope to continue next week. Try to give some time for a little Pesach reflection next time. Good night, everybody. Take care. Love to mom and dad, and good night to all.
Bye-bye, good night.